Alright, welcome back. Hopefully you've had a chance to get working on your environment. I threw a simple proxy base model together, just something that for me it would be able to sort of look at the entire environment without having to build each one of these little buildings. It's a time saver for me. It helps me get my thoughts together. This is kind of like a sketch, only instead of just a regular 2D drawing, or like how we started with our overheads, we get to really see it for the three-dimensional shape it is. And here would be a good opportunity to look at it and say, all these buildings right here, there's a lot of these are all the same height, so maybe now would be a good time to maybe scatter these a little bit, make them just a little bit different compared to the others, just so that you can start adding some variety to it. But what I thought we would talk about today is attaching our camera to a motion path. Now, keep in mind that a motion path is a really useful technique, especially if you're not really clear on making handmade animation, keying things by hand. So if you've already taken certain classes that have taught the processes of moving objects and controlling things in the graph editor, this technique may not seem as useful because you'd be able to do it simply by doing it by hand. But this is a really useful technique for folks that are just starting out because it offers them an opportunity to sort of see where they're going to go, plan things out, and then even control things like how quickly they move through one area, how slowly they might move through another. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to first make sure that our plan is in place. We don't want to start anything without really having a good idea of what we're going to do. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll just come over here, and if we turn on wireframe, this may help, but it also may hurt depending on how detailed the ground plane is. But you can see that my buildings are pretty clear. You can tell where everything is. So what I'll do is I'll just go over to Create, and I'll choose CV Curve Tool. Now I'll open it up inside of the option box, but if I didn't, I could always just double click on the little icon of the curve to bring up my tool settings. And I just need to make sure that cubic is set. Remember, if we had it set to linear, it would be very jagged instead of a smooth curve. And as we have our camera moving along this little roller coaster, we want to make sure that it's a smooth ride. So what I'll do is I'm going to decide that I want to start farthest away from this object over here, which I'm calling the castle. So I want to start from this direction, travel in this direction, go down the main street, maybe go around this area. Maybe this is a town center or a some kind of a Stonehenge, whatever it is. This is something that maybe you've made that you really want to put a little bit of extra attention to before moving on. Okay, so just start clicking and drawing this out. And we'll swing around this object, and then we'll end. Now you might want to end at the front of the castle. You might want to end like at a 3/4 view of the castle. If I go into wireframe, you can see this is the last curve point that I made. And now that I'm happy with it, I'll just hit enter. Now the first thing that I need to do is just make sure that I don't have any serious issues with this curve. If there are any points that are too close together, it might make for an odd transition as my camera is moving along. So just make sure that everything is looking smooth. You might have to adjust little things like that. Maybe we're making sure that things don't travel inside of another object. We're just going to make sure that they're going around them. Okay, so now I can see my path. Now it's very important to draw it in the direction that you want it to go. However, if you haven't, let's say for example that you've already created your curve but you accidentally made it go in the other direction. Curves really do have a start point and an end point, and it's all based on the order that you drew the points. But if you accidentally did it in the wrong direction and you just need to flip it around, just come over to your surfaces, go to your Edit Curves option, and right here it says Reverse Curve Direction. And what that'll do is it'll make the starting point the end point and the end point the starting point. Okay? So now that I've got my curve going in the direction that I want, of course we know that it is along the grid, which means that it's sort of underground right now. So I can just raise this up. And just so you know, even after I've attached my camera setup, I'm still going to be able to edit these curves. So if there was a reason that I wanted to go a little bit higher at one point or a little bit lower at another point, I'm still going to be able to do that, and I can see it update with that camera going along for the ride. So it's very useful. Okay? Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is, of course, save my work while I'm working. And then I'm just going to come over to Create Cameras. Now, there are always more than one way of doing something. But keep in mind that what we're trying to do is give us the most control for the least amount of work. Okay? So, instead of using just a regular camera that we would have to animate moving and looking all the time, we're going to choose a camera and aim. Now the reason we're going to use this kind of a camera, is I'll just come over here, is that notice how this little object right here, let me hide that little texture here, this little ball sits in front of the camera, and as I move it around, that camera will always look at where this object is. And the best part about it is it will look at that point even if the camera is moving. See how it's always looking at that one spot? So this is a camera with an aim. So this is going to be very useful, especially for what we're trying to do. Now, there's a couple things that we have to do first, because the computer program, Maya, doesn't necessarily know what we want to do with this camera and this little aim controller. When it first created it, and if I open it up inside of the hypergraph, you can see it, it put it all inside of a group. Now, it's very strange, but for some reason, because this little icon here isn't really the object is a locator, we don't see it visible here. Okay? Now, if I open it up inside of my outliner, I can just open this up, and you can see that there's actually two objects, even though this one is hidden. So a simple solution is to just select your camera aim, go to Display, and say Show Selection. And the next time you open up your hypergraph, okay, there it is. So if I double click on it, it just shrinks the group down, and when I double click on it again, it opens it back up. So now what we've got is the camera and the camera's aim controller, and we can see them. Now, honestly, it doesn't really matter if you can see it in here or not, but if you open up your hypergraph and you don't see it, I didn't want you to be too confused. Okay? Now, the first thing that we're going to do before we do anything else is I have to make sure that everyone understands that this camera should never be moved once you've created it. Okay? I'm going to say that again. Don't move this camera once you've created it. If you move it inside of this world, you're not going to get the result that you want once it's riding the roller coaster. Okay? So, here's the very simple steps that we need to do. Okay, so once we have our camera, all we're going to do is pull it out of that group. Okay? So, how did I do that? I used my middle mouse button on this object and simply pulled or dragged it away, and the computer understood that that meant that I wanted to unparent it from the group. So, this camera is still listening to that aim. Okay, don't be confused. Just because it's outside of the group doesn't mean that it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Now that this group is by itself, I'm going to do Control-G and put it inside of a new group. Okay, so we have the original camera group, and it has the original camera aim, and then we have a new group, and the only thing inside of that is the original camera. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to name this camera move GRP to just let me know that that is just a group. All right. The next step is with that camera group selected, okay, keep in mind I still have that group selected. I'm now going to select my curve, okay. So now I have my camera group and my curve selected, and I'm going to come up into my animation options, and I'm going to go animate, motion paths, attach to a motion path. Now, I have to open it up inside of the option box because by default, a few of these settings may or may not be what you want, okay? The first one is right here. It says time range. Right now it's set to the time slider. Now the time slider is this number set right here, this little scroll window right here, and it goes from frame 1 to frame 24. Well, if we're making animation at 24 frames per second, how long is your entire trip going to be from the tip of the curve all the way down to the end of the curve? Well, according to this, it's only going to be 24 frames. So this is the part where you have an option. You can either change this number, so if we wanted it to be, say, 10 seconds, we would make it 240 frames, and just hit enter. And notice that because I did it inside of this window changed, and it updated, so it's all the way to the end of 240. That's the first way to do it, if you already have your time slider set. If you don't have your time slider set, you can say, I have a start number and an end number in mind. So you can see that the start time is 1, the end time is 30. So I could change this and I could say I wanted it to be 240. Now even if the time slider only went to 19, it would still go to 240. But keep in mind, you wouldn't be able to see the animation until you had all of your frames visible down here. So it might just be a little bit of a time saver to have your settings so that it is using the time slider and you do have it set to 240. That'll just guarantee that you don't have to take multiple steps later. Okay? Now, what we're going to do, the rest of this is perfectly fine. It is exactly the way that we need it, as long as someone hasn't gone behind you and changed it. So all you really have to do is just hit reset your settings. That'll just make sure that all of these settings haven't been altered in any way, and then we hit attach. Okay, now notice that my camera has suddenly shot way over here to the end. And the reason that it's on this spot over here is because that was the frame that I was on at the bottom right here in my time slider. So watch this. If I start all the way at the beginning, you can see that there's my camera over here. And as I start to move forward, that little dot is my camera moving through my world. Okay? Now, a couple of things to point out. On the computers that you're using, not the computer at your house, not the computer that, is brand new and no one's ever changed any settings. But there are some classes, and they are learning how to do character animation. If this setting doesn't work exactly the way that you see mine, chances are, for example, if you're scrubbing through and your camera just doesn't seem to be traveling along this curve, but when you get all the way to the last frame, it does come over here, well, that means that your animation settings aren't set quite right. That's an easy solution to it. The first thing you can do is before you actually hook this up, you can open up your animation settings down here next to the little key. You can jump straight to your animation settings. Well, that's your time slider settings, but we're going to jump over to animation. And just make sure that your tangents are set to auto. If they're not, they could be set to like linear and stepped. And stepped keyframes are great for when you're doing character animation, but they're not going to be very helpful if this is what you're trying to do, make an animated camera. So if you simply go back to auto and hit save, the next time when you set it up and do the animate motion path attached to path, then it will move. Now, if you've already done it, not to worry. There's still a way that we can change it. What we need to do is we just need to select the camera move group and go into its attributes. Because notice that right here, right next to the actual tab that says this is a group, you see it says motion path. Now this motion path is how we know where it's supposed to be on the curve at what point. Okay? So you notice that if I start at frame 1, it says the value is 0. That's because that's the 0 point of this curve. And as I start moving forward, little bit by little bit, this number starts to get a little higher. So you can see that as I start moving forward, it's still a fraction. And that's because once I've made it to 240, I've reached a single number. In other words, a single time down this curve. Okay? So this motion path knows that the entire length of this curve, doesn't matter how long the curve is, you may have made yours different from mine, but this is the number and it goes from 0 to 1. Now an easy way to get into some of these settings is by just right-clicking inside of that little window and going to the motion path uValue output. So when I do that, you're going to see this little window. And you can see here it says my time is frame 1, and I can actually change that. If I didn't want the first starting frame to be 1, maybe I wanted it to start at frame 24. So I wanted it to be still for the first few frames and then start moving. I could certainly do that. You can see here it says value. The value is where is it along this curve. And then we have these over here. I'm just going to scroll over. And it says in tan and then out tan. What they're talking about is that tangent. Remember, when we looked at our animation settings, it said tangents. All they're talking about is if we were looking at this as a curve like on a graph. So think about it like the stock market. Do things shoot up very quickly? Do things have a very slow progression and then move up? By the way, all of this information is in the PowerPoint that I've given you about this particular technique. So, if it's not set to auto, all you have to do is click and drag, and this way with all of these highlighted, once I've typed in auto and hit enter, I've changed it for all of them. Now I know it was already set to auto, so let me just show you. If it was linear, they'd all be changed to linear. If I highlighted all of them and said spline, they'd all be changed to spline. If I changed all of them to flat, they'd all be changed to flat. But if we just set it to auto for right now, auto works just fine for what we need to do. Okay? So, once you have these set and you know that your animation key type is set to 1, then we know that as we move our camera around, things are going to work just fine. Now, you might be wondering, if we did it to the group, and the group, if we look at our transforms inside of the channel box, we see that the translates are yellow and the rotates are yellow. What this means is that there's some sort of an effector. Something is changing or something is forcing this object to do something. Okay? Now, usually when it's yellow, it's some kind of a constraint. Okay? So this object, this group, is basically locked into doing something. And in this case, it's a motion path. So that means that the group has no choice but to follow that curve. Now, think about it like a train on a track. If you're standing on the train, are you actually locked to the tracks? No, you certainly don't feel that way because you can stand up, you can walk around, you can do whatever you need to do. Well, that's what's happening inside of this. The camera, because it's simply parented to the group, is going to move as though it is actually locked to that curve, but it's not. And the nice thing about it is that means that it is free to look at the original look controller. So, the first thing that we'll do is we'll just move the look controller into its first position, probably something like this. So we'll go all the way back to the beginning, and we notice that right now my camera is underground. It's not really a big problem. I just have to select the curve, go to my control vertex points, select my first curve point, and just drag it up. And notice that the camera really has no choice but to select and follow along. Okay? So now what we have is the camera sort of moving forward just like that. And maybe we want to actually see what this camera sees. Okay? Well, that's very easy. If I open up multiple views, I can change one of my panels using a perspective to that camera 1. Now remember, camera 1 is the camera that we created. Perspective is just the working window that we've been working in. So I'll select camera 1, and here we are. Now, before I start deciding my actual camera angles, I'm going to make sure that my renderable camera is set to camera 1. My image size is the size I plan on rendering, and for me it's going to be 1080. Okay? This way, when I turn on my resolution gate, I actually know what I'm planning on rendering, and I can see it just like that. Now, watch this. If we come over to panels, I can come over here and say tear off a copy. And when I do that, now what I have is a floating version of this. So that means that I get to come back into this window, and as I start to make adjustments, I can actually see it happen right there. So isn't that tricky? Now I can grab my little look controller, and I can actually turn and maybe try to come up with a really pretty composition. Remember, everything that we're doing has to look as good as it can. And one really easy way to make sure that our compositions are strong is by following the rule of thirds, right? So, if we imagine that this image is chopped up into 9 perfectly symmetrical pieces, we have a slice here and a slice here, even across one direction, a slice here and a slice here across the other. Where those points meet are basically those power positions, those positions that to the eye and to our own subconscious and to the audience's view are the best places to put something. So maybe I will start my camera just like this. So even though the camera is going to start moving, and if I highlight inside of there, I can actually see it. This is going to be the view so far. Now, notice that now it doesn't really look like it's working at all. Well, that's because we have to animate this little look controller. So this is the first position. I think it's a really nice establishing shot. Okay, and an establishing shot lets the audience see sort of the big picture, right? Like if you're going to have a movie about New York, the first thing you start is the New York skyline. If you're going to have a movie about, the backwoods of Arkansas, maybe you're going to find, just some really nice shots of flat land and creeks and things like that, just to sort of get the audience involved. Say, hey, this is where we are. This is what we're going to do. And if it was an outer space shot, maybe it would start with stars and planets. Maybe it would start with a great big ship passing by. Okay? Okay, so before I continue moving forward, I'll make sure that I save my progress. And of course, my scene is set to save in increments, because if it's not, then I'm just begging the computer to destroy my first and only, my one and only file. Okay, so just keep that in mind. By the way, you should never try to move this object from this view. Bad things are going to happen, okay? Always move it from inside of this view. It's going to make your life a lot easier, promise you, okay? Don't try it. If you do, expect problems to happen. All right, so this is our first position. So I'm at frame 1, and in order to hand animate this little point, and remember, I know that we haven't really gone over animating things by hand, but this part really isn't that difficult. I'm going to just hit the S key. Now when I do that, notice over here that all of this area turned red. Where did we see a value that was red just a little while ago? Well, if I go back to my curve, I can see that inside of my motion path, here is that red value. That means that this is a key and this is a key. So these two values are keys, just like the value that I manually created here. Okay, so as the camera starts moving forward, there's going to come a point when the camera just no longer looks nice in this view. So what I can do is I can change the angle or the position of this little sphere to maybe get us a little further down the road. Okay? Now, a good rule of thumb is less keys on this object makes for smoother animation. Okay? So just remember that. So here we are, we're moving forward. And then the camera is going to reach a point where this point is no longer good. So what I'll do is I'll just move it further down, always keeping that point ahead of myself. Okay? Okay, so we can start back from the beginning and just scrub. And by the way, if this motion isn't moving very smoothly, if it's taking a lot of effort for your camera to show you the view, you might just have to start turning some things off. For example, if you've already got some paint effects in this scene, if your scene is just, if there's very complicated objects, things that you've added a lot of detail to, or to simply to say it straight, maybe your computer isn't quite as strong as you'd like it to be. All of these can be opportunities for this to not really play as smoothly. Now I'm just dragging it. This isn't really showing me the right speed, but once we get a couple of keyframes that we like, I'll show you an easy technique to ensure that that things are the way that you want them to be. Okay. Now, you notice that at this point, I keyframed it here, and then as the camera was going around, I set another keyframe, but notice that it's the same place. What I'm telling the computer is, I don't want you to make any changes between this space. Okay? So, as the camera moves forward, I have to push it a little bit forward. So what I'll do is I'll just make the camera look at the castle so that as it's coming around, okay, so this little spot right here where the camera is starting to turn around, it looks like this doesn't move soon enough, because if I watch this little view, you'll see a little wiggle. See that? I would much rather, as the camera is coming around it, to have already slowly started to make its way over there. So what I need to do is I need to change the location of this keyframe. Now, there's more than one way of doing anything, but one of the easiest ways to do it is, because we know this is the keyframe that's doing it and we need it a little bit further back, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down my Shift button, use my middle mouse button, and simply drag over top. I've highlighted that key now. Now I can use either my left mouse button to simply drag it back, or I can use my middle mouse button to do the same thing. The only difference is the camera won't try to update the view if I use my middle mouse. So here comes the camera again. It's moving across, and now it starts to look up a little sooner. Oh, and that's where we end. So we obviously don't want our camera to be underground for the grand finale. So I'll grab my point, maybe raise it up a little bit. And then I'll grab the move tool, or the look controller, one more time, and just make sure that that's really where I want it to be. So maybe since we started with a view like this, maybe we can end with a view looking down from the castle. So maybe just raise this up a little bit. And now we can see the castle looking down to the town. And like I said, if this was going to be the really important thing, if that was going to be the town square or whatever else, I can make sure that it's the thing that everybody's looking at by putting it into one of those rule of thirds. Notice that there's nothing in this third. There's really nothing specific in this third. There's really nothing specific in this third. So if we light it correctly, and if this is where the detail of the work is supposed to be, that's what we'll see. Okay, so we've got a first pass, and now it's time to see it for what it really is. Now, in order to see this in real time, we have two options. The first option is we simply hit play inside of our playlist, our options, and when we hit play, we hope that this is really happening in real time. We don't know for sure that this is happening in real time. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that some of our settings, for example, inside of our playback speed, right now it says play every frame, maximum is real time. What that says is you're allowed to play every frame, but you cannot play any faster than real time. The other one is actually just saying play it in real time. Now, when I hit play, you may not even see much of a difference, and that's just because this particular computer that I'm working on is not necessarily a very slow computer, and these objects are pretty simple. There's not a whole lot that is going to tax the computer. However, I still don't trust this. Granted, chances are it is correct, but I can't trust it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make what is called a playblast. A playblast is basically turning this view that we see right here into an actual movie file. And if we turn it into an actual movie file, we can play it, and we know that it's not the computer trying to show us all the 3D stuff. It's just a little movie. Now, in order to do that, we just right-click inside of our playlist, or excuse me, inside of our time slider. I'm going to right-click, and there you can see it says Playblast. Now, I'm going to go over to the option box because there's a couple of things that we need to make sure of. If I set this back to reset everything, notice that right now it says what kind of format do you want? In other words, what kind of a file do you want to see? And it's set to AVI, and I would probably recommend that that's not what you do. Okay? So what I'm going to do is choose QT instead, and QT stands for QuickTime. Okay? So this means that this is going to be a little .mov file. As far as encoding goes, I'm looking for something that is fairly simple and compressed, so I'm going to choose the H.264. Now, what is the H.264? Well, the H.264 is Sony's Blu-ray codec. So what it means is, even if the file is very big, as in the picture itself is large, the file size will still be fairly small, and the quality will still be good. Speaking of quality, you can see right here, it says by default I'd like to see 70% of my quality in this image. Well, you can turn that up to, I don't know, 80, 90, 100, it's fine. We don't plan on keeping these little files unless we're trying to show them to people. I've used these to send to clients, and I have to explain to them, listen, this is not the finished version, this is just the work window that I see. But a lot of times, directors and other animators, they're going to be able to look at this window and they're going to know right off the bat what they're seeing. So that shouldn't really be that big a deal. Scale. What they're talking about is the actual scale of this window right here, not the 1920 by 1080. It's actually the size of the window that I've created. Okay? So if I want this screen to be the right size, I'll just say, you know what, I'd like to see it this big, the thing that I have right now. So that would be scale of 1. Now, frame padding. Frame padding is really unnecessary at this point because what we're making isn't really image sequences, so that's okay. And it says here, remove temporary files. Keep in mind that what we have right now is going to go into a temp folder. Now, if this is something you do want to keep, all you have to do is switch it over to Save to File. And it says the movie file is going to be called Cooley Motion Path because that's the name of my file. It's also going to be saved automatically inside of your project's movie folder. So it's very convenient. You can also save these in increments. So you can show like the beginning, sort of as you're making changes, you can show the process, which is always a good thing to be able to show. It proves that it's your work. So once I'm happy with everything like that, make sure that this is the window that's actually activated and just hit Play Blast. Now what the computer is going to do is it's going to play all the way through the video, and then it's going to open up either the Windows Media Video File Player or QuickTime. That all depends on your own computer. Okay, now 10 seconds to shoot all the way through this massive city may or may not be exactly what you want. But this is a good opportunity to talk about how to make changes. Once we've got what we have so far, it might be the sort of thing where, wow, you know, I'm flying past all of my really nice work. I put so much effort into it, and we just don't get a chance to see it. Well, that's no problem. We can always update both our animation keys and how long it takes my camera to get from point A to point B. Okay? So this is basically the halfway point. Inside of this video, we talked about the entire process of attaching it to a curve, setting it up so that the animation inside of the look controller is doing what it's supposed to do, and how to see a preview. In the next section, what I'm going to talk about is how to control and how to change some of those animation keys. Okay? So I'll just pause this and we'll move on now. Alright, so let's start by just taking off the animation keyframes that we had before. So I'll go back to the beginning because I know that this is basically where I want it to be. And what I can do is just highlight, just like I did before, holding down the Shift key and dragging with my middle mouse button on top of all of the keys that I don't want right now. Right-click and simply say Delete. So now you can see that there's only one keyframe, and the rest of the time it just stays right where it is. So the next step is to either select the curve itself or the camera move group, because both of these objects have that same motion path on it. Now keep in mind, motion path 1, if we look at the curve, has motion path 1. It's the exact same thing because this curve knows that this camera, there's a connection there. So this tab right here is the same for both of them. So if I right-click and go back to that motion path value, notice here it says here's frame 1 and here's the location. Here's 240 and here's the location. Well, let's say that I wanted this animation to instead be 480, which would basically be twice as long as it was before. So instead of 10 seconds, now we have 20 seconds. All I need to do is select the time and change it from 240 to 480, and I hit enter. Now, notice that at the very end, we now have 480, where originally 240 was. Okay? So, we've doubled the distance, or excuse me, we've doubled the time in the exact same distance. So now when I hit play, you'll notice that the camera moves considerably slower, because now instead of 10 seconds to get from here to here, it has 20 seconds to get from there to there. Okay? Now, that's just the first part. Okay? Now we're dealing with 20 seconds. And now we have a little bit more control. And now we can start to specify if there are any places where we need to slow down or any places where we need to speed up. Now, in order to do this next step, we do have to make sure that the camera move group, the thing that's actually attached to the curve, is what is selected. So I'm going to look at it from the top view. And let's say, for example, that traveling through this area right here, we want to just slow down a little bit. So we can see that as we hit play, we're having this sort of normal speed, and we want this area to just be a little bit slower so that we get an opportunity to see all the nice stuff that you've taken into account and you've taken the time to make. So what I'll do is I'll just scrub to about here. This is going to be the starting point where we want things to slow down. Okay, so we don't need any change here, so we don't need any additional keyframes here. This is the one we do want. So once I have it in the right spot, I simply come over to Animate, Motion Paths, and then right here it says Set Motion Path Key. Now, I'm going to use the little tear off icon right there, and that's going to keep this as a little floating window, because I plan on making more than one. So I'll click this button, and so let me just show you what's happened. Inside of that motion path U value, look at now we have 3 locations and 3 times. We have frame 1, frame 152, because that's where I am when the camera made it there, and then frame 480. Because this has a value, the computer knows that from 1 to 152, this from 0 to 235 blah blah blah, this is the distance it's managed to go in that amount of time. So if I move forward and I say, you know what, at this position I need another key because this is where I want it to change. I'll create a new one. And again, you can see that now we have a 4th. So we have a frame 1, frame 152, and frame 226, and then our final frame. So all we have to do is, if we want this to take longer, is we need to make this number higher. Because right now it says I can get there from here to here, I can get from here to here in about 70 frames. So if I increase this and say, okay, now I want it to be 280 and hit enter. Well, because there's now more frames between these 2 points, it's going to slow down because now it has more frames to travel the same distance. So let's see what that looks like. I'll just jump back. And so hit play, and you can see that it's traveling at that normal speed that we had. And then when it reaches this point, notice that it's slowing down. It's slowing down just a little bit because I've added some frames. Okay? Now, if that isn't enough, we can make it even longer. Let's say 320. So I'll pull back and hit play. And now this distance didn't really change much. But then suddenly, now you can really see that this area is definitely slowing down considerably. And then it starts to ramp up speed because it needs to finish at the same frame. Okay? Now, we can always adjust these little control points. We can change the location of any of these, the actual distance or position, and we can change the time. So the real question is, does it really need to have 150 frames from here to here? Well, if your answer is no, then you can even change this one. So instead of 150, let's say half of that, 75. So we'll pull back and hit play, and you can see that this moves quite quickly and then suddenly slows down a lot. That's because we have from 1 to 75, it takes this distance. From 75 to 320, it takes about the same amount of distance. Okay? So can you see how from the starting point to the second point, that's 75 frames, so that was moving pretty quick. Now, if it's too fast, just put some more frames to it. So we'll say 115. Pull back and hit play. So now it doesn't move quite as fast, but I still got some of that frame time left inside of where I wanted it to stay. Now this might be moving too slow now, so we would simply take some of those frames away. Let's say 300. So that's taking away about a full second in between that. So we'll say, okay, here we go, we're moving. From this point, we really start to slow down. Then we start to pick up speed again, and we're continuing on. Now, before we ever add any new key points, I want to make sure that this first section is correct. Because what may happen is as we're starting to add new frames, for example, if I want this to move just as slow as this, I'm going to need to increase that final frame. Maybe 20 seconds isn't going to be enough. That's fine. I don't mind if your animation is a little bit longer, just so that we actually can see the things that you did, but you don't want to go so slow that you run out of things to look at. If your audience starts to get bored, you know that it's a problem. So one of the best things that I would suggest is ask me, ask some of your fellow students, ask them to look at some of those movie playblasts that you've made, and that way you'll be able to get some feedback and you can see where people are saying, you know, I'm just not seeing why we're moving at this point so slow. Okay? So I'm going to maybe put this back to 280, and we'll have from here to here a medium speed, from here to here a nice slow speed, but not so slow as it's becoming very boring. Maybe even drop that down a little bit more, say 250. Okay, so that means that from here to here we're looking at about 10 seconds, which might be a little bit more than you want, a little bit less than you want. It's going to be entirely up to you. So let's say that I'm happy with that position. The next thing that I'll do is I'll start at the next spot, and I need to make sure that, again, my camera move group, the thing that actually is attached to that, is what's selected. So I'll say set a new motion key, and we can see here inside of here we have that new one. And then I'm going to move forward, and let's say that about here is where I think we can continue on, because whatever you're going to put here, this really important nice thing, we just want to have an opportunity to see it for what it is. Okay? So about there we'll say add another one. So now we have the 289, which is this one right here. So from 289 until 340, it makes it from here to here. But maybe I don't want it to be 340. Maybe I'd rather it be 400. So now we can pull back and we can start watching it go again. So you can see that it's the normal speed, and about here it'll start to slow down so that we can see the town. And then about here it'll speed up. See that? And then it slows down again so that we can see this. And then we have 80 frames to go from here to here. Okay? Now, if you wanted something to move faster, all you have to do is decrease the number of frames from one point to another. So remember, this is the first frame. That doesn't really change unless you wanted it to sit there and do nothing for a little while. Once we've added a new keyframe, that's where we start a change. Then we add another one to say, this is the start of the change, this is the end of the change. And then as we move forward, this is the start of the change, and this is the end of the change. And then we just let it finish up. Now, if it moves too quickly from here to here, all you have to do is change that last frame. If 480 is too much, then you can just take it down a little bit. It's not a big deal if it's an odd amount of time, as long as it works for what you're trying to do. Okay? So the last step is simply going to be to put that little look controller in the right spot at the right time. So what I need is I need to bring back my little top view, my little floating window. Start from the very beginning. Remember, this is the angle that we wanted, so it still has the keyframe. The camera starts to play forward. And then I chose probably about here is where we'll want to move over to where the town is. Also notice that with this little key icon turned to red, as soon as I move it, because it already had a keyframe, it's going to automatically make a new keyframe for me. So we'll just play forward again. And a really good, useful tip is to always, always, always keep this point further ahead than you might think you need. Okay? because it's always going to look ahead, which is great. So we can see that this right here really feels nice and smooth. But as we start to get closer to it, see how it has to flip around? We definitely don't want that to happen. So we just keep moving it forward. And then we can get over to this, this market or Stonehenge or, this sacred place, whatever that happens to be for your story. And then this is where the camera will slow down a little bit so we get an opportunity to see it. Now, let's say, for example, that now we have this slowdown. I suddenly realize that I'm in the wrong spot. I don't want to accidentally move my camera. What I do want to do is move my curve. So I can grab the points and simply pull a little bit further back so I get a better angle. Okay, so just keep in mind that this is not something that may be locked forever. You might have to go through and make some subtle adjustments to suit your needs. Okay, so again, we'll find that point where we want to stop looking here and begin to look over at the castle. So I'll just hit a new key because now this distance is where this change does not happen. This icon just stays right where it is in the middle, and then the change is allowed to happen. And then we'll just move that one last little bit so that we, again, use that rule of thirds so that that special thing, whatever that happens to be, is in a nice composition. Okay, so we've got what we want. Let's go back and hit play. Just make sure that that this is all working, that we don't get any major hiccups or any problems that we might not have seen before. Things seem to be working pretty well here. Oh, wait a minute. Did you see that? So at this frame, we've actually traveled inside of this building. Now we have two options. The first one is we can move the curve, or in this case, because this building really doesn't matter that much, just move the building slightly, and now the camera doesn't care. What we can also do is inside of the town, maybe I'll go and grab those vertex points, and I'll just pull back so that I'm inside of that and I can see it. Maybe I'll drag it down a little bit so that I feel like I'm more on the ground plane with the town. That might feel a little bit better. And then as we head over to the sacred place, I'm just calling it the sacred place. I don't know what that's going to be, but we'll just smooth that out a little bit. Okay, there we go. So now we start from high on a hill. We hit play. We start heading down. Now we're in the town. Yeah, I like that a lot better. Now we can see what you've put, inside of there. We raise up a little bit so that we can look down on this sacred place. Then we look up to our castle, and we look down to the rest of the world. Now, I still don't know if this is officially the real-time view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click and go to Playblast. And remember, the last time I made a Playblast, it saved it. So if I don't change the name of this, it's going to say, do you want to write over top of it? So watch this. I hit Playblast and it says, hey, wait, this file already exists. So if you don't want to overwrite it, just hit Cancel and make sure that your next one has something like 01 on it, and then 02, 03, 04, that kind of thing. So we hit, make sure that this is the window that's activated, and we hit Playblast. Now you can see that this is moving really, really fast. That is not the actual playing speed. That's just the computer being able to work really quickly to make your Playblast. depending on how complicated your scene is, this playblast may take some time to build, especially as you start to add all the details and, animating, paint effect stuff, whatever happens to be in your scene. But I think that this is a really good example of the sort of camera work you're trying to do. So we start with a nice rule of thirds shot. We're always keeping the castle in the distance so that the audience knows kind of where we are in the world. And then when it's time to look at the right thing at the right time, the camera does what it's supposed to do. So there's nothing that's very jarring. There's nothing that's really sort of sticking out as a bad thing. And what's really nice is now you know what will be seen, what won't be seen. You know exactly how much detail certain areas should have. And hopefully this video has really helped you. This takes a little bit of practice. Obviously, the very first time that you do this, you might run into problems. If you do run into problems, for example, if this little look controller just isn't doing what it's supposed to do, or it's doing it in a way that you didn't expect, chances are the easiest thing to do is just get rid of those keyframes. Just delete them all. I already showed you how to do that. Just delete all of your keyframes and start over. Or if you accidentally move your camera, there's a few things you can do. It might simply be a better idea to just delete the camera and reset it. Just start over. Ungroup it, put it onto the camera's curve. These things do take some practice, so be patient, and I think that this will help a lot. All right, so good luck, and I'll see you soon.